Привіт, це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Мене звати Ангеліна Карякіна.
А я Наталка Гуменюк.
Наталко, давай почнемо з питання, де ти знаходишся, тому що саме з цього місця і починається розповідь про нашу гостю.
Якщо дуже широко сказати, я зараз перебуваю в Мехіко-Сіті, у Мексиці, але зараз, зокрема, з візитом, але частково також на запрошення мексиканської публіцистки, письменниці, діячки, викладачки політології Денise Dresser, яку майже рік назад я також мала можливість зустрічати в Україні, але зараз я тут. Цей візит в Мексику є також частиною не просто ідеї показати мексиканцям, що відбувається в Україні, і достукатися, розказати те, що стосується воєнних злочинів. Ми це робимо після того, як ми подали кримінальний позов в Аргентині, в федеральному суді, у справах тортури за системою універсальної юрисдикції. І тому ці кілька візитів, які я маю в Латинській Америці, вони також пов'язані з тим, щоб ми могли розказати про це не тільки в Аргентині, а мати суспільну підтримку, скажімо так, в цілому континенті, тому що Мексика закриває цілу Центральну Америку. Це велика аудиторія, і дійсно тут була змога в мене так само розповісти про це за підтримки Денise і за підтримки дуже-дуже багатьох інших людей, щоб все-таки це була справа дійсно не тільки, скажімо, україно-аргентинська, а загалом важлива для цілого континенту.
Розкажи, будь ласка, чому серед усіх мексиканських журналістів, журналісток, публіцисток, коли ми робили проект «Поєднуючи континенти», ти обрала саме Denise Dresser?
Коли ми починали цей проект, була ідея запросити до України не просто людей, які би написали статтю, чи які би зробили репортаж, а які би зрозуміли, приїхали, розібралися, і могли б стати такими комунікаторами між країнами. Я, працюючи над тим проектом, завжди шукала людей, запитуючи колег і в Мексиці, і в Латинській Америці, і всі свої можливі контакти. В різних країнах, чесно кажучи, я мала багато рекомендацій. Коли я пояснювала, кого я хочу запросити до України, дуже багато людей одразу говорили: в Мексиці точно є така людина, це Denise Dresser. Однією з перших людей, хто рекомендував її, була Енн Еплбаум, але з іншого боку це були так само інші мексиканські, латиноамериканські, різноманітні діячі. Вона є не просто дійсно журналісткою, тому що насамперед вона є політичною аналітикиною і оглядачкою, просто створює свої проекти, виступає на телебаченні, коментує політику, пише книжки, працює в різних комітетах і радах комісії з прав людини свого часу і має майже 5 мільйонів твіттер-фоловерів.
Денise була в Україні майже рік тому. Я пам'ятаю її враження від України. Це дуже глибока людина, яка роздумувала, розмислювала над тим, які паралелі є між нами. І говорила про те, чим мексиканців може зачепити, заживе українська історія, війна Росії в Україні. Про що ви з нею говорили? Чи це була розмова, все-таки, яку ми не договорили? Розмова її вивезена з України? Чи ви все-таки шукали ці паралелі між Україною, Мексикою і між тим, що поєднує наше суспільство?
Не тільки, що поєднує наше суспільство. Звісно, говорила про те, як пояснювати світові, зокрема латиноамериканському, Україну, і як шукати цю емпатію. Ми так само говорили про те, щоб українці могли зрозуміти про Мексику і, скажімо, той поділ, якого насправді в такому чистому вигляді, як інколи його показують, праві-ліві не існує. Денise є доволі відомою критикиною чинного президента, звинувачуючи його в авторитаризмі. Я говорю про президента Мексики, в них свої складні відносини. Я можу сказати, що президент не приховує свою не дуже проукраїнську позицію. Він має таку практику щоранку звертатися до нації. За своє президентство він там 123 рази згадав Denise. Але що мені цікаво було, зараз у Мексиці також будуть в червні вибори президентські. Президента Обрадора більше не буде. Змагання відбуваються між двома жінками, в тому числі з жінкою, яку обрав чинний президент. Денise відома феміністка. Вона фактично така ікона феміністичного руху тут, тому що якщо ти йдеш по вулиці, ти завжди знайдеш людину, яка скаже: «Боже мій, це можуть бути і жінки, і чоловіки, які можуть зупинитися в машині, зупинитися в кафе, дякувати, просити сфотографуватися. В той же час можуть бути і ненависники. Мексиканське суспільство доволі поляризоване. І от в цьому контексті ми говорили і про мексиканську політику, і про як працювати в такому суспільстві, про свободи, про величезне насильство проти жінок, яке має місце в Мексиці, а так само той рівень насильства, який захлинув цю країну, про те, як намагаються в різний спосіб влада мілітаризувати країну, щоб боротися з наркокартелями, але насправді борються вони дещо з іншим, створюючи таку неправову систему. Це про все, що ми говорили, але також говорили і про зростаючий вплив російського посольства і Росії в Мексиці, яке сьогодні одне з найбільших в світі, хоча Радянський Союз і Мексика не мали таких відносин, як інструменталізують цю країну. Тобто ми говорили про дуже багато речей, тому що без них не можна було зрозуміти цю країну і так само говорити про те, як можна достукатися. Тому що я тут так само з серією показів документальних фільмів, які організовувала в тому числі і Деніс, але не тільки вона, в різних університетах країни, в Мехіко і за межами Мехіко-Сіті. Я мала зустрічі там із аналітичними центрами, із ключовими представниками медіа, бізнесу, показуючи фільми нашого проекту. І я, власне, говорила про те, що а як це робити в країні, де там 130 тисяч пропалих безвісти? І коли я називаю цифру 125 тисяч зареєстрованих випадків воєнних злочинів в Україні, як звертатися до цих людей? Коли тут щодня вбивають 9 жінок, коли в країні є надзвичайний рівень насильства, і як говорити про те, що не розказувати щось в нас погано і війна, як знаходити оці всі речі, щоб бути почутими. Я хочу ще одну річ додати. З одного боку, Деніс тут дуже відома як така дуже критична фігура. Саме не так, як до влади, як до певних авторитарних трендів, які є, але вона робила дуже багато для того, щоб я почула її опонентів. Зокрема, буквально зараз я додам, що зараз в мене 3:30 ночі, я маю дуже сильно поспішати на літак, але ми не так давно закінчили перед цим останню таку вечерю і розмову. Вона запросила дуже багатьох людей до себе додому. І серед них чоловіка, який є її одним з ключових критиків в політичному шоу, де вони дебатують. Тому що він має іншу позицію на ту якусь соціальні речі, які зробив цей уряд щодо там підвищення соціального рівня, освіти. І вони якби завжди є такими спарінговими партнерами в одному з ток-шоу на великому телеканалі. Але їй так само було важливо, щоб саме він прийшов, щоб він був там на презентації її книги, якою зараз вона також займається, про те, як бути громадянином в світі, який стає більш авторитарним. Це якраз не той випадок, коли є людина затята в своїх переконаннях, але коли людина відкрита і розуміє, що треба дотримуватися плюралізму.
Просто хотіла би ще пригадати один момент дуже характерний. Я не знаю, чи ви з нею про це говорили. Після її поїздки в Україну і після її статті про Україну з'явилася якась неймовірна кількість іспаномовних коментарів. В неї безумовно, але і на наших сторінках в соцмережах. Там прийшли в коментарі люди, які або пов'язані з російським посольством в Мексиці, або які люди симпатизують Росії, які казали, що чому ви в своїх матеріалах про Україну не взяли другу сторону російську, не озвучили, і що їх готові були цьому посприяти навіть в російському посольстві в Мексиці. Мені просто цікаво було, чи ти питала взагалі, враховуючи все це, і погрози, і тиск, рівень її впливовості в себе в країні, про те, як вона взагалі чисто по-людськи з цим справляється.
Так, і це буде, я прошу всіх дочекатися кінця нашого подкасту, тому що я запитувала. Але вона тримається і розказує свої невеличкі секрети, як з цим працювати, але ми розбирали також, що з цього є справжнім, а що є частиною такої кампанії, в тому числі і російського посольства, що є частиною внутрішньополітичної боротьби. Але так, не тільки я запитала про це, але й запитала про те, як бути настільки активною і затятою людиною, тому що я енергії Деніс заздрю. Ми проводили великий захід в університеті, приватному, одному з найбільших, найвпливовіших в день, де покази, і вона модерує, це велика подія. Після цього я знаю, що вона їде на презентацію своєї книжки, а після цього на презентацію в інше місто. Я думаю, що варто також послухати, звідки береться ця мотивація. І вона не просто внутрішня енергія, вона дуже пов'язана з відчуттям того, що можна робити для свого суспільства.
Таких людей, в яких багато важливих справ, дійсно багато енергії, як би це парадоксально не звучало. Гаразд, давайте слухати розмову з Деніс Дресер, мексиканською публіцисткою, політичною аналітикиною та журналісткою.
I'm very thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for having me in Mexico, in your place, meeting all the incredible people and learning. Thank you for the opportunity for me to tell the story of Ukraine, the story of what we're living now. But I think for our Ukrainian listeners, what is the most, interesting to start, first of all, it's still your impression about Ukraine. You came on our invitation almost a year ago. It was your first time in Ukraine. But when I'm here, talking with you in different occasions, in different universities, wherever we are here, in the center of Mexican political life, I see this trip stayed with you. And you're really one of the most profound supporters of, Ukrainian freedoms in Mexico. So maybe you would tell why you care about Ukraine.
Well, first of all, it's a great joy to have you here. I feel that I'm able to give to you what you gave me in Ukraine, which is an insight into my country and to how my country views yours, and hopefully set up the stage for you to have ties with people here who care about Ukraine. I fell in love with the country. I want to go back. I've only been there once. I want to go back there many times. I think the reason I care so deeply is that to me, Ukraine represents the struggle for freedom, the struggle for autonomy, the struggle to defend democracy in very difficult circumstances. In a world that is experiencing democratic backsliding, as is the case of Mexico now, where we will soon have presidential elections, and in all likelihood the ruling party will be reelected, and many people don't understand how we are sliding into autocracy. It's inspirational to see others fighting for basic rights. It's inspirational to see how Ukraine views itself as a defender of liberties for many other countries. It's inspirational to see that despite, dire circumstances, I went there prior to the counteroffensive, right before it began. And at that point, there was a sense of incredible opportunity that Ukraine would overcome, that the counteroffensive would truly be a decisive turning point in the war. And as with many others, I watched with tremendous pain and a sense of great concern what began to happen in terms of the war. Russian entrenchment, Russians willing to sacrifice so many of their own people to put them through the meat grinder. Putin, impervious to international law, impervious to the death rates of his own people. And even after the assassination of Navalny, to see Russian society incapable of understanding what's at stake. Ukraine, for me, represents an emblematic battle, truly, between good and evil. I still believe in those categories. I still believe that sometimes there are no grays, that there is a black and there is a white. And to me, Ukraine represents the white that I think many others in the world should understand. I was among those who cheered when the aid package for Ukraine was finally passed in the American Congress. And hopefully that will signify a turning point, make things harder for Putin, make things harder for him in terms of continuing with the war, hopefully vis-a-vis his own population, but also, as Anne Applebaum has said, a psychological boost to Ukraine and a psychological blow to Russia, that it cannot continue just advancing it as it has without strong resistance from the West, from Europe, from the United States. I'm disappointed in the reaction of my own country. When I was in Ukraine, President Zelensky was critical of the leadership in Mexico of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is on his way out. But regardless, his successor in all likelihood will continue this policy of alleged neutrality, which in effect ends up supporting the Russian position. I would encourage you to come back and for more Ukrainians to actually make themselves present in Latin America, because it's important that Ukraine explain what is happening. While there are so many other conflicts going on in the world, I think that if Ukrainians managed to tell their stories in a way that connects emotionally and connects in terms of our own history of having been invaded by the United States and suffering the brunt of imperialism. I saw it with your trip here when you showed the documentaries of Russian atrocities being committed in Ukraine, that created an instantaneous sense of empathy and common humanity with the viewers. And that's a way of keeping Ukraine on the forefront of international attention. And I think it's something that you all need to do more of. I realize I'm asking so much of you in the midst of the war, but I find it quite disappointing that at least in Latin America and many countries of the global south, there has been a distance and a desire to maintain autonomy in the face of what I see as just such a clear-cut struggle of democratic aspirations versus authoritarianism and imperialism.
I'd like you to explain this perception of this war in Latin America. But also, to be honest, I'm more positively surprised by the empathy we feel. I think the Ukrainians felt it at first when there was a support, financial, humanitarian, but even moral support from a lot of countries in Latin America. Later, of course, the longer war lasted, there was all these issues connected to neutrality, weird things which different presidents told, this pro-Russian stance. But I also, while being here, while talking not to you, but to people you introduced me, but I understand you're trying to do it like in a more broader circle. I see there are way more potential support. We in Ukraine more often would see what AMLO, what your president says, what Kristina Kirchner says, rather than those people supportive of Ukraine. So we in fact have a stereotype that Latin America is more pro-Russian. And usually it's really about like, oh, there are left in Latin America. They thinking about Russia as, as a legacy of the former Soviet Union. Somehow this idea about far right in Ukraine had grown in that territory. So there are these leftists in Latin America who do not get it. But, when you speak about the president of Mexico, it's not like he's portrayed by the Western press often at the left, but he's not really that left. Can you really explain, is it really about this left and right? Because it just doesn't feel relevant, but that's how a lot of people in Ukraine and also in Europe see the reasons why there is this neutrality or at least lack of support towards Ukraine. And of course, anti-Americanism, but it's all connected, from that legacy of the 20th century.
Well, first of all, I'd underscore a point that you make. One is the official position of Latin American governments and Latin American presidents. And then another is societal support for Ukraine. And I think that the second is true and it exists and it's something that can be nurtured and can be capitalized upon. There's a whole other issue of foreign policy. There, I think that many Latin American presidents are playing geopolitical games or figuring out what they can gain from supporting Ukraine or remaining allegedly neutral. And polls show that despite Russian propaganda in Latin America, it's not as if Latin American societies are pro-Russian. I think, if anything, the position of presidents like López Obrador or like Lula in Brazil or even Petro in Colombia, it's not so much a question of left or right. It's of trying to distance themselves from the United States for domestic political reasons. Because the United States has a history of not good involvement with Latin America. As you probably know, in the 1970s, the U.S. was supportive of right-wing coups, was supportive of dictatorships. It has invaded Latin American countries. So for us, the imperial power has been the United States. It hasn't been Russia. I'd say especially for the old kind of Stalinist radical left in Latin America, there is some sense, a false sense that Russia still represents, the progressive, allegedly progressive values of the Soviet Union. But I think that's a minority position. More than anything, the tepid support for Ukraine it's more anti-American than it is pro-Russian. The more that Putin demonstrates that he is willing to disregard the Geneva Conventions, violate international law, for example, sequester Ukrainian children, take them across the border, blatantly violate the rights of Ukrainian civilians, I think that is diminishing his support in the global South. But at the same time, no one feels like it's appropriate or domestically understandable or feasible to wholeheartedly embrace the United States in its support for Ukraine, especially because we've seen the United States be the invading power in other places as well as in Iraq, etc. I think the less that Ukraine is perceived as a proxy government or proxy war for the United States, the better it is. So I actually think that this is the silver lining of the cloud. The fact that the aid package for Ukraine took so long to approve in the U.S. Congress, I think should show to people that the Ukrainians are not fighting a proxy war for the United States.
Still, there are concerns about, Russian propaganda here in Mexico. Honestly, at first I also thought that about this, line about the Soviet Union, the left. But what I found very interesting, that Mexico as a country didn't have very good relations with the Soviet Union. The relations were not that deep like in some other places. And in fact, the Russian embassy is a phenomenon which is growing today. And RT, the Russia Today, is like promoting itself in Mexico City now. They try to create this narrative as if they were always here. It's quite a recent phenomenon. And would you explain more? What I was also very much interested in, that the former ambassador to Mexico, it was a very scandalous Russian persona, Victor Caranelli, who was, prior to that, the Russian ambassador to Argentina at the moment when there was the bag of cocaine found in the territory of the Russian embassy. And then that guy was brought to Mexico.
Well, first of all, Mexico did not have close ties to the Soviet Union, although some members of the Mexican intellectual class did in the 1930s. Even people like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo.
But was it because of Trotsky? Trotsky was...
Exactly. And then after Trotsky gets killed here, and then Mexicans begin to understand the effects of Stalinism, there is a break. And also remember that in terms of Latin American history, the Communist Party in Mexico was always combated by the Mexican government. We had an authoritarian party in power here for over 70 years, and it was staunchly anti-communist. So that's why the Soviet Union never really made inroads in Mexico. It has under this president, because Andrés Manuel López Obrador has elective affinities with extremely radical left-wing leaders like the Cuban leadership, like the Venezuelan leadership, like the Nicaraguan leadership, because he likes to portray himself as anti-American in some specific cases, because that helps him with his electoral base, even though Mexico pragmatically and for reasons of economic survival maintains its free trade agreement with the United States. So this is really just political ploy on the part of López Obrador. But I think that his proximity to Russia derives more from his wanting to poke it in the eye of the United States from time to time so as to appear more independent than he actually is. And unfortunately, this has led to the opening of the doors for Russian influence that it had never had in Mexico in the past. I think that I mentioned this in one of the articles I wrote about Ukraine when I was there, how after the full-scale invasion, many of the diplomats who were kicked out of Europe actually came to the Mexican embassy, to the Russian embassy in Mexico City. And the case of the Argentine ambassador now ending up in Mexico, that's part of what has been going on. And the expansion of Russia today on billboards in the subways, on the billboards all over Mexico City and in other places, you see these huge ads for RT trying to present itself as an independent media, when people who know about these things understand that it is a vehicle for Russian propaganda. And I think that the Russians are playing the long game in Latin America. And my hypothesis is that it would be in their interest to see a more authoritarian Mexico, at the same time a more criminally infiltrated narco-state, because that would force Americans to deal with another open front and another international conflict, and one on their borders.
But I think what is important to say is that it was like around 40 diplomats in the Russian embassy accredited, and now it's like over 80?
Yes, and I think, the Russian embassy in Mexico is the largest embassy outside of Russia's embassy in Washington. So the Russians are using the Mexican embassy here as a way of probably spying on the U.S., of disseminating propaganda in Spanish, intervening in the domestic policies and politics of countries where there are big issues at stake and where leftist governments may be willing to fall under the Russian sway. From what I can see, there's a lot of money and a lot of energy being invested in Russian propaganda in the region. And I think the essential goal is to either destabilize or to create support for a particular faction, or to discredit opposition parties that are critical of Russia. I remember a colleague, a former Mexican ambassador to the United States, said that if Mexico veers toward authoritarianism and ceases to be an electoral democracy, the big winner geostrategically is going to be Russia. So there are interests at play here.
While being here and giving interviews to Mexican journalists and also talking to the Mexican public, I think that the argument they really understood when they were asking about, for instance, American aid to Ukraine and how Ukraine is preparing itself for Trump, I said, I think Mexicans understand well how is it to be involved and becoming an inner issue of the U.S. domestic politics without willing to be so. We don't want to become the part of the inner politics. And Mexicans don't want, but they are. The country is, and I think people understand that. But it's really interesting for me can you really explain how Mexicans see now the first possible, results of the American elections, but also when the aid to Ukraine by the U.S. was so much tied to the solution of the, let's say, I don't know how to call it, correct, what the American press call the issue of the border between Mexico and the U.S. People become interested. So what's the problem? What's going with immigration? Why it's such a big thing? Somehow you see, we become related in this regard. These things are more connected than we thought.
Well, I think there are many countries in the world that are anxiously viewing the U.S. election and wondering what the fate of the world will be, how geopolitics will be affected if Trump wins office. But I'd say that the commonality between Mexico and Ukraine is the extent to which we have become a part of the campaigns, an issue over which politicians have to take a stand. In the case of Ukraine, it's will the U.S. government continue to send aid to Ukraine under a Trump presidency? And for us, it's the fact that Trump made anti-immigration sentiments, anti-Mexican sentiments, a central part of his campaign during his last presidency. And he has vowed to close the border, for example, or has used this as a way of attacking President Biden and saying that Biden is soft on the border because there's been growing immigration going through Mexico and attempting to cross into the United States of Haitians, Nicaraguans, Hondurans, Salvadorians. even Argentines and Venezuelans because of the political and economic crises of their own countries. And this influx of immigrants has turned immigration into the key issue, even though it really shouldn't be, because it's something that affects only certain states on the border and certain sectors. It's not this impending invasion of the other, as Trump portrays it, as an existential threat to white hegemony. But he's managed to turn it into the central issue in the U.S. campaign. He uses it to beat Biden over the head. And he also is using it he's going to try and extract more concessions out of Mexico if he wins, in terms of renegotiating the free trade agreement or imposing tariffs. Or at one point he said, we should just drop bombs on Mexican cities where narcos live, or maybe we should invade, the Trumpist, very violent, very confrontational rhetoric. But Mexico has become a political piñata within the U.S. American political system in a way that Ukraine has at times as well. After the passage of the aid package, you're now seeing splits in the Republican Party, those who are calling for the Speaker of the House to be kicked out, the political removal of Mike Johnson. And you've also seen Republicans try to use the issue of Hunter Biden and his ties to a Ukrainian company to put them at the center of the political debate. But the truth is, if Trump wins, we'll all have to prepare ourselves. Ukraine and Mexico will have to prepare themselves for what is essentially unknown and unpredictable.
But before that, there would be elections in Mexico. Interestingly, you mentioned how tired you are of quite a cliche questions by the Western journalists. And how is it when there are two major candidates are females? So what is in fact at stake?
We have two women candidates, and I'm not going to use the traditional, cliche journalistic categories of one is from the center left and one is from the center right, because I think it's a simplification. There is a woman who is the candidate of the ruling party, a very handpicked by the outgoing president, who has tried to portray himself to the foreign press as a leftist, while he has militarized the country, tried to take control of the Supreme Court, tried to undermine checks and balances. And then you have a woman candidate of the opposition parties that are weak, that are discredited because they governed in the past, because they have a history of corruption. She is trying to win on the basis of a platform of the defense of Mexico's incipient, weak, troubled democracy. We've only really had electoral democracy in Mexico since 2000, when we were able to kick the ruling party, the PRI, the Revolutionary Institutional Party, out of office. And now we're seeing another party attempting to recreate that same kind of dominance and create a situation where the incoming president, even though she's a woman, she won't necessarily be a Democrat, because this party has hegemonic pretensions. It wants to take control, capture most of the institutions of the state in order to assert control over the political system and carry out its agenda, which some would categorize as a leftist agenda. And I'm more circumspect, because I do not believe that militarization and left-wing governments actually, that doesn't coincide. It's jarring to me. The name of one of them is Claudia Sheinbaum. She is from Morena, the ruling party. The other one is Xochitl Gálvez, from a coalition of the PRI and the National Action Party and a small left-wing party called the PRD. So one is an opposition alliance. The other is essentially the ruling party with some other small satellite parties. But according to the polls, Morena and Claudia Sheinbaum is going to win. And so the key issue for Mexico is, and few people portray this in the Western media appropriately, it's really a struggle between a new variant of authoritarianism, extending its grip over the Mexican political system, or the defense of a deficient and incipient but necessary democracy based on checks and balances and based on a semblance of a rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. In this sense, Mexico has been experiencing a process of democratic erosion, which, coming from Ukraine, you'll understand because you've seen this. You saw it happen in Poland, you saw it happen in Hungary, you saw it happen in Turkey, you saw it happen in the United States under Trump.
We saw it happening in Ukraine after 2010. We just managed to stop it.
Yes. And here I'd like to insert Mexico into the category of countries that are experiencing democratic backsliding. And the paradox here is that even though there are elections can bring into office people who then bend the rules of the game or try to take control of autonomous institutions so that they can stay in power. Democracies aren't dying as a result of military coups, but as a result of populist leaders who manage to rig the game after they are elected to office.
You mentioned violence, and being here, I also understand how huge is the issue. You have hundreds, thousands of people disappeared, killed, gun violence. Huge issue is the drug trafficking and narco-cartels, which is real, which is really something not we see in the series or films. Because of that, probably militarization of the society, using army to suppress. Could you a bit explain what's going on and what is at stake, how the situation is? Because there are towns, where you won't travel. I've been to Guadalajara and wasn't in the town nearby where people were literally saying that our town known that the bodies of the people are brought to our town by the cartels because there is a place.
Well, sadly, what we've seen over the past 20 years is the growing influence of cartel violence. Mexico is one of the main exporters of fentanyl to the United States, and we have been complicit in the opioid crisis. Previously, we used to export heroin. Now it's fentanyl with precursors coming from China. And the problem is that we have had now 3 governments that have been incapable of devising a policy with which to deal with this growing issue. So you're a country at war, and yet we probably have more instances of deaths, femicides, and disappearances than you do, although we are not a country in the midst of a full-scale invasion from another power. And the problem with Mexico is that you see an absence of the state. The state doesn't have the capacity to take on criminal gangs. And in many places, I'd say the U.S. State Department says that cartels operate in 2/3 of the country. And you see cartel violence advancing and areas of the country where civilian governments are no longer in charge, where it's essentially cartels that are extorting, that are kidnapping, that are economic forces and political forces of their own, that are kind of these parallel governments, fiefdoms in no man's land. And unfortunately, the route taken by 3 consecutive governments has been to militarize public security. And that hasn't led to greater pacification. It's led to even more deaths because the military isn't really prepared to fight a war against the cartels without also killing civilians.
What is a cartel? I would kind of also know that from the films, but there was iconic in a bad way, ideas. There is Pablo Escobar, and there are some people like that. What are those cartels? What are the modern cartels not just in the beginning of the 21st century, but today?
Now there are 4 main cartels. 2 of them are very famous, el cartel de Sinaloa from Sinaloa and the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación from the state of Jalisco.
It's where Guadalajara is.
Yes, and they're essentially large organizations that their core business is producing and selling drugs in the Mexican and the U.S. market, largely in the U.S. market, but also in other markets. I mean, Mexican cartels are now transnational entities that launder money, that have operations in many other countries, and they're a very successful market. I mean, they have earnings of, $80 billion a year. And they have very sophisticated weaponry, which they import from the United States. It's very easy to buy weapons in the U.S., particularly in states like Arizona and Texas that have very lax gun laws. So American weapons are arming Mexican cartels. And in the face of that, you have a very weak Mexican state that oftentimes is infiltrated by the cartels who pay people off. They pay off prosecutors, they pay off policemen, they pay off generals. In a country where GDP per capita is so low, narco bribes are a very efficacious way of gaining control and protection for yourself and operating with absolute impunity.
To be honest, I'm puzzled with that because I understand how to fight foreign invasion. You have army, you have defense, you build a system. I don't really find like an easy way to deal with the organized crime because the trade-off is that you can create a very strong security apparatus, which also has actually happened like in 70s in Latin America. At that time, they were fighting guerrillas, they were fighting political opponents, but really became the institutions which tortured people. There were abduction, unlawful detention.
There was a dirty war. There were military dictatorships that came about as a result.
So I'm worried, like, if you're just thinking like, oh, the way to fight cartels in Mexico is just like enable stronger security in this continent. It sounds...
No, and that's why you're seeing countries like Colombia and others start to legalize drug production, because ultimately that's going to be the only solution. There is a market, and the biggest market for drugs is the United States. And what the United States has forced Latin American countries to do is to fight the drug war in their own territories while the U.S. remains the main market for consumption. And you don't see Americans fighting the drug war in their own nation. On the contrary, it's an American imposed agenda where we're putting the lives and the blood and the violence, while at the same time, very little is being done to combat the opioid crisis in the United States. So I think the ultimate way of dealing with this is legalization, but it's something that the U.S. government is not willing to discuss. So we're kind of stuck in this worsening status quo.
But can you connect it to the violence against women? Because there is a very specific thing about women homicide, about amount of the women suffering. But why particular women? Because, guns kill everybody. But in Mexico, we're really speaking about, we discussed with one of the feminist organizations here, which I met thanks to you, like whether we use the term femicide or women homicide. But why women? Why it's so bad with that?
This is, in many ways, it has been a quite conservative country. And at the same time, we have this archipelago of progressive political views in Mexico City. Mexico City has 20 million people. And this is where the Me Too movement, where feminism started gaining traction. This is a city that decriminalized abortion over 20 years ago. And the demands of Me Too have resonated and have led feminists to become very empowered and to create a broad-based alliance that transcends political ideology, transcends class, transcends skin color. It's the Mexican feminist movement is quite emboldened, empowered, very vocal, and it's been able to get abortion decriminalized in state after state. And then you've seen a backlash from macho men, from conservative parties, from the Catholic Church. And in a country where you have so much impunity, where 98% of crimes go unpunished, it's very easy to kill a woman. But the reason we call them femicides is, yes, men die too as a result of the war on drugs and just general violence. But women are killed specifically because of their gender. And this involves torture, it involves rape, it involves being killed by their partners or being captured in an Uber and then killed in a car and left on the edge of a highway. The United Nations has declared a pandemic of femicide in Mexico.
Can you tell the numbers?
The official numbers are between 9 and 12 women in Mexico are killed a day. Just do the math, and it's huge numbers a year. And the problem is not just the femicide, but the impunity, the fact that so many men get away with it. And this particular government over the past 6 years has been toxic for women, because even though President López Obrador is portrayed by the Western press as a progressive or as a feminist, it's been a toxic 6 years for women. He is quite conservative. He derides the feminist movement. Over the past 6 years, every time we march, we are gassed. The police is sent out to encapsulate us. He sits in the National Palace behind these huge panels of steel and discredits women who fight for their rights and say that we are being manipulated by conservatives to undermine his project to transform the country. There was a fascinating podcast in Foreign Affairs about the link between autocrats and anti-feminist stances, because feminism is very anti-authoritarian. It's anti-patriarchal. It's for horizontal rights for everybody. And in that sense, it's anti-autocratic. So I think autocrats are wary and oftentimes frightened by feminism. And I'd say that the truly consistent opposition in Mexico has been the feminist movement. And it's been something that the Mexican president has not known how to deal with.
When I was talking to some of the Ukrainians who wants to reach out to the Mexican society, but also, I've done here numbers of our screenings of the films on the Russian committed atrocities and war crimes. And I usually everywhere use the figure that, General Prosecutor Office of Ukraine has registered 130,000 alleged war crimes and breaches of Geneva Convention. But then, I'm in the discussion and they say but we have 133,000 disappeared in Mexico. And then you think how can I the figure I'm saying, what should it entitle for the audience in front of me? What do I ask? The compassion? I'm trying to explain how difficult to investigate that. And I am just thinking where I am, what I'm saying, how it's perceived. I see on the human level that when you show a particular film about, Ukrainian local mayor who has been tortured, there is an empathy. There is an empathy to the stories of the deported children. But I really got this, very honest question of one of the diplomats here who said, it's actually very hard because we don't know how to tell this story because also there are so much suffering and the death. So the way just for us tell that, we have a lot of suffering, it doesn't work. And oddly enough, I'm telling also something else. I'm coming here from Argentina where we submitted a criminal case on the crime of tortures. And it's very relatable to Argentinian societies because they had it during the dictatorship. But here, at one of the screenings, we understood that, people are not that much shocked by tortures. It's not like that they are shocked by this. They have empathy, but it's not something which made, them, wow, that's happening. How can happen this in normal life? How to talk, how to find this, how to cut through this.
I think that when you show the films that I've seen, when you show them in places in Europe, in Sweden, in Finland, and there will be a sense of shock that this is happening in the 21st century in Europe. When you show them in Mexico, at this point, violence has become so widespread, so normalized. You open up the newspaper. I just read a story about how 6 dismembered bodies were found in the outskirts of Guadalajara.
Where we both were yesterday.
We were both there yesterday. And
by the way, I just really want to say to the Ukrainian audience, Guadalajara is a stunning, beautiful, very developed city, like Kiev, like anything. So also when you hear this name, just also to understand it's an amazing town.
And Mexico is an extraordinary country. The depth of its culture, of its arts, of its history, amazing cuisine, amazing innovation in the arts and music and theater. And it's a country of extraordinary natural beauty. But it coexists with this kind of the dark side of violence. But when we read about what is being done to Mexican women, I was on a panel recently with a woman who's become famous. She's a saxophonist. She plays an instrument and is known for her musical talent. Her partner threw acid on her face. And this is becoming common in Mexico. And now they're trying to pass a law to prevent it. But when we every day read of women, young girls who are raped, who are tortured, who end up in canals, as I said, in basements or on the edge of highways, and you look at the numbers, trying to somehow generate empathy for Ukraine, for what we should have empathy for, but at the same time, to us, seems smaller. And it seems less, it's the result of an invasion and of a war. And in our case, it's the result of our own people degrading women, or Mexican cartels killing their own people.
But how to find this, like light in a tunnel to cut through to the people, to have this, solidarity?
What I think is important about your trip here and the message that you're conveying is to say this is not normal. And what Russia has been doing, these are war crimes, and these events need to be prosecuted. And to convey to Mexicans that what we are living through is not normal, and that there have to be prosecutions, and that there has to be accountability, and that people need to be paying attention, and that they have to push for the judiciary to actually act, for the police to act, for the next woman president to figure out a way of defending women and standing by women, because many people in Mexico are celebrating the fact that the next president will be a woman. Well, it'll just be a symbolic victory if that woman elected does not figure out a way of dealing with violence against women. So coming here and saying to us, in my country, we are prosecuting these kinds of crimes. In a democracy, this should not be allowed to happen. People who do this, whether political parties or political leaders or drug cartels or a foreign power, need to be held accountable and need to be prosecuted. And this is something that we need to develop even a language for speaking about this in Mexico. And I think that the language of human rights and understanding what standards of democracy are about and the importance of rights. Many Mexicans don't understand their rights because we lived under authoritarian rule for such a very long time, and our democracy is so new. And having someone come and say, hey, you have a right to have your case prosecuted and to be listened to, and for your perpetrator to be punished. I think it's kind of a form of international pedagogy that can and should be shared internationally. And we've seen how these symbolic, not symbolic, but arrests, for example, of Pinochet, or what has happened in Argentina of the still ongoing trials for what happened 30 years ago. This is a teaching experience. And coming to Mexico and teaching people that even if there were crimes committed a year ago or 6 months ago, that you have the right to demand that someone be held accountable. I think that this can create a kind of cross-national conversation.
In another encounter here, I had a chance to speak to a group of the alumni of Western universities here in Mexico, very well-established people, far from the human rights and media, from finance, all kind of venture capitals, like not usually my gang, but they came, they wanted to listen about Ukraine, they deal with AI, very smart, incredible cohort. And they were asking mainly the questions like, and there are so many Ukrainian, refugees, would they return to Ukraine? Most probably not. And I would just explaining why we want to get them back, why they probably won't return, why there is no opportunity for them to return now. And then I like, hey, how many Mexicans are abroad? And they told 50 million in the US. And I said, by the way, I'm curious, is there any state program or an idea how to return own people back to the country? And I was told, no. But I'm really thinking, what is a way to return the people to your country? Or maybe we just need to accept.
There is a difference because the people who left Ukraine left because of a war and left because their own survival was at stake. In Mexico, people who leave do so because of the wage differential in many cases. It's very different to earn $15 an hour than to earn $1 an hour. And in the United States, Mexican immigrants actually have trampolines of social mobility. After a generation, they become middle class on the basis of their effort and because they're in a place where they have tools for social mobility. In Mexico, I think only in the past, I'd say 10 years have you seen people leave because of violence. But it's a combination of violence and a better economic future. For Ukrainians, they didn't want to leave. They were forced to leave. In Mexico, people leave because they think that they will have a better future elsewhere. So I think the possibility of Ukrainians returning to Ukraine depends largely on the outcome of the war. And I think that people will want to come back. You have a sense of family, of community, of history. Ukraine is a marvelous country. In Mexico, living in the first world and living in a country that in many places is still extremely poor.
When Anne Applebaum introduced you to me, she was explaining that, to understand who Denise is, I was at the march with her and everybody wanted to make a selfie with Denise. When I'm here, we go to one university, somebody wants to make a picture with you. The car is stopped, somebody waves you. In the cafe, somebody, tells something to you. So I really reconfirm your popularity. You are now in the book tour. The whole week, I've been here sometimes, but you twice flew somewhere to present your book. You had numerous presentations. But at the same time, I know it's hard. You constantly attacked on the street by your president in the morning press conferences. There are caricatures of you appearing every single day or another day. How do you cope? How are you doing? Because it's extremely nasty. You look very strong, but you can't ignore that.
I find the question very strange coming from someone who is surviving in the midst of a war. It's a different reality, but I think my case is emblematic of what happens when a society becomes extremely polarized. And polarization, as we know, is a real danger to democracy. And here the polarization has been provoked by a president who early on started governing saying that he represented the voice of the people versus the elites, the people versus the privileged, the people versus the foreigners. And I've been a critic of many governments. This is probably my 30th year of being an analyst and a critic, and there's so much to criticize of bad governance in this country. But I'd never encountered what I've encountered now, and it's a true result of polarization and of the president portraying me dishonestly in the morning press conference as a traitor to my country or as a representative of foreign interests because of my name, even though I was born here, Mexican mother, etc. Because I've tried to maintain my democratic principles and the causes that I've fought for a very long time, which are transparency, accountability, citizens' rights, defending the rights of women, checks and balances. And this government has put all of those things at risk. And previous governments did so too, but never to this extent. So in that sense, I'm an existential enemy to López Obrador, even though I don't think I'm that important. But the 123 attacks on me in the morning press conference lead his supporters. And I'm litigating because I consider this an abuse of authority, an abuse of power on his part. I do not think that presidents should be singling out critics in press conferences in order to generate a negative sentiment towards them among his base. Because just as I receive the praise from people who say thank you for defending democracy, I receive death threats and attacks and criticism from people who support him and who view me as a threat to their movement. So how do I deal with it? Well, I have 3 strategies. There are 3 A's. Amor, which is love and friendship. Armadura, which is like an armor, like a knight's armor. You just put your armor on and you go into battle every day. And the 3rd A is alcohol. At least a glass of wine every day so that I'm able to survive what I think is fighting the good fight, as long as I am able to do so. And I have many allies, many other, especially brave women, journalists and activists, and we protect each other. We move together. We embrace each other when we are attacked. It's not just me. It's a coalition of incredible women in Mexico who use their voice and their pen and their platform to fight what has been in many ways an anti-democratic, very paternalistic, and quite anti-feminist government.
I won't say you enjoy your fight. I don't think we all want to fight, but you enjoy what you do. You really work hard. You can afford do less. Why you do more always? That's the question. Why you never stop?
Because as in The Lord of the Rings, we are all hobbits. Remember, Frodo didn't want to leave the Shire. He was comfortable in his own little peaceful community. And then he is forced to take the Ring of Evil to Mordor. And he has to do so with the Fellowship of the Ring, with the elves and the gnomes and the men. And I feel that we all have to carry the ring. And I'm carrying as much as I can. And if I don't carry it, or if someone just shirks from their responsibility, the ring is never going to be destroyed. So I'll do my part, and hopefully successive generations will continue to do that. And at some point, we will reach Mordor, and we will destroy the ring of corruption and of violence and of anti-democratic rulers and of perpetrators of violence and organized crime. And I think I do this because there isn't another alternative.
At the early stage of the full-scale invasion, I chatted with our common friend, Anne Applebaum, and who is historian. And I, at some point, said, look, I might sound very naive. It's very silly to tell something from a journalist. But yes, it feels a bit like in The Lord of the Rings. And she said, no worries. Actually, Tolkien wrote his book based on the real wars. He was historian of the wars. So it's not fiction. It's not fairy tale. It's really something. So it's not that naive to think about in these categories.
No, it's one of my favorite books because it teaches you that there is good and that there is evil, and that the forces of the good end up triumphant over evil when they unify. And that's why I'm doing this book tour, going to unexpected places.
Your book is about?
It's about being a citizen in a time of risk. So what I've been trying to do, and many others have been trying to do, is to build citizenship so that people understand their rights, so that people don't just remain silent, so that they understand what is at stake. The Lord of the Rings taught a whole generation about the Fellowship of the Ring, and I feel that I'm doing my bit of domestic pedagogy by trying to make people conscious of what they should not sacrifice.
Thank you so much for everything, for what you do, for what you do for Ukraine, what you do for Mexico, for being an inspiration, and also looking forward to welcome you back in Ukraine. It's not just the world. We will develop a plan when you'll come, that you'll give a lecture, you'll have a talk. All is set up. It's just a matter of the date. But I would round it up with the phrase you heard many times, at least a couple of times you heard. And it's not the phrase from another important fictional story. I'm speaking about the Star Wars. I would just generally say, as the app, English version of the app, which tells us that airstrike is over, says in Ukraine, may the force be with us.
Thank you. And I just want to reiterate that my heart is with Ukraine. I am very anxious to go back. I want to travel. I want to write. I want to do radio and TV and convey a sense of urgency to the Mexican public, which I think I managed to do in my last trip, to the extent that even the Russian embassy started trolling me on Twitter, now X, and the Mexican president was very upset about my trip. So I'm hoping to upset everybody again and draw attention to just how much Ukraine needs all of us.